Civil liberties are freedoms, and civil rights are positive actions of government to ensure that the civil liberties are given to all citizens. So the civil liberties are what are your rights, whereas the civil rights are the government protecting them, like the right to vote is a civil liberty, whereas civil rights are the government's responsibility to protect your right to vote. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, and the 14th Amendment adjusted citizenship to include blacks. So those two things will be civil liberties. But they weren't protected, so they got the civil liberties, they just got shorted on the civil rights, so the civil liberties didn't really matter. In 1863, slavery ended, and the Ku Klux Klan was an anti-Reconstruction organization. They were against anything that changed the South from pre-Civil War. They especially opposed the carpetbaggers, who were people who went from north to south to help with Reconstruction, and the scallywags, who were Southerners who supported black emancipation. So the carpetbaggers are the people who came from north to south, and the scallywags are the people who were already there in the South and were supporting it. Most abolitionists pretty much just forgot about the blacks after they gained their freedom, because they thought they'd adjust, and that didn't really happen. They weren't accepted. A lot of people blamed Reconstruction for that. Charles Sumner, the senator who came, he was one of the weirdos who kept fighting, and during the post-Civil War era, and he really went into segregation. He pushed really hard for it in the 1870s. That didn't happen until 1954. In 1874, he died, and in 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed, and it did pretty much nothing. It was just a tribute to Sumner because he worked so hard for it, for desegregation. It was the last civil rights legislation until World War II, or after World War II. In 1870s, Reconstruction began. In 1880s, the black leaders started to emerge, and the blacks thought that World War I would be their chance to show their worth, but it failed. They weren't accepted. In 1909, the NAACP formed, and they forced the military to accept blacks, but they were given menial and dangerous jobs. They worked supply lines, and really, if you're going to attack us, where are you going to attack? Supply lines. It's where it hurts us most. Just to prove that their jobs were more dangerous, 14.4% of blacks died in World War I, whereas only 6.3% of whites died. So that's more than twice. I'd say it's more dangerous. The military was segregated, and in some areas, black soldiers weren't even allowed to walk in victory parades. They fought just as hard, and they had more dangerous jobs, but they weren't even allowed to celebrate the victory. The effort to gain civil rights, protection of their rights that they had, picked up in the 1940s, and more so in the 1950s. In 54, Brown versus the Board of Education occurred. It all delayed because of the Depression in the 20s and 30s, and in the 40s there was World War II, so it really just wasn't in the forefront. It wasn't the most important thing for our country. And the Harlem Renaissance led to unification and organization, which really helped out with the civil rights movement, which was the fight to enforce civil liberties. And like I said, it started in the 1880s, but it didn't happen until the 50s and 60s.